I think that's interesting, and I'll mention, I mentioned this in the intro, and I'll give a little context here. But so you were in Africa, I believe it was South Africa at the time when you were in jail.
No, Zimbabwe. The
Zimbabwe.
worst was I did live in South Africa. Zimbabwe was where the
Zimbabwe, and you owned a farm that more or less, we won't get into all the details of it, or maybe we will, but due to political strife at the time, your farm was more or less taken away from you, and you were put in jail because of that.
Yeah.
So you're saying the easy thing for you would have been to just walk away and say, okay, like this is dangerous for me and my family. There's no way to win here. I'm going to walk away. But you decided to fight it because it felt like the right thing to do. Could you say a little bit more about that? Like that calculation in your head, what made you decide to say, I'm going to fight this?
Okay, so the situation built up over 3 years, right? It started in one part of the country, government taking farms. Yeah, I don't need to go into the background, and it spread. And it eventually got to the district we lived in. We'd had 43 farms in that district, much bigger than Canadian farms. We were one of the smallest at about 1,000 acres. There were many 5, 6, up to 10,000 acres. They were all taken over. Farmers, some left early, some stayed sort of almost to the end. Some were beaten up, some were attacked, some were shot at. None in our area were, yes, one was killed. And we held out because I felt we had to make a stand. And I also felt if enough people could hold out, we could turn the situation around. We didn't. Too many people gave up too early, in my opinion. So we held out, and I was optimistic right to the end that we might win. Until the last couple of weeks, I knew we couldn't win. The odds were against us. We were the second last farm still operating, and the third last was still with the owners on the farm. The writing was on the wall, but I still couldn't give up. I couldn't voluntarily move off that.
And how come? How come? Why was that you couldn't give up?
Because my whole being, my whole way I'd been brought up, my whole life was, while there's a chance, you keep on fighting. And it was the right thing to do. I refused to surrender. So the police tried to arrest me twice. They got me the third time, put me in jail, and dragged me into kangaroo court and said, if you agree not to go back to your farm, we'll let you go. Otherwise, you'll go to a bad prison in the bush for 6 months, maybe forever, maybe you get killed. So at that point, the best thing to do was to say, okay, because I couldn't, being locked up, I couldn't look after my family or anything. So at that point, I did concede. But I live with myself believing that I fought to the end on that particular one.
And why? Zoom out a little bit, Peter. What?
Yeah.
Why was that so? I mean, there's an obvious why that was so important. You've already explained it, right? The way you were raised, you felt like it was the right cause to fight for. But in that moment, how did you? Obviously, at some point, the calculation changed to where you didn't do it. Like, how were you thinking about it in the grand scheme of life? Was it that? In some ways, this is the reason we're on this earth, which is to fight for the things we believe in. Was it more simple than that, where it was just, I wouldn't be happy with myself if I didn't fight this? Or maybe even more simple, where it was, I don't want to leave my farm and I'm trying to just hold out as long as I can. Like, what actually drove you to say, in the face of great adversity and danger, I'm going to stick with this and try and see this through?
All of those that you mentioned, all three, were major components that went through my mind. Was one more important than the other? It boiled down to, I suppose, this is my farm. It's the right thing to do, and I'm doing it.
What about when it changed? When they made you that offer, and you obviously had to take it? And I'm not judging it by any means. I don't know that I made it that far. What changed in that?
Because I had to concede then that I'd lost the farm. There was no way we were going to get that farm back. Right? There was
so
no
in
way.
Some ways, that optimism was gone. There was no longer a belief that it could happen.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. So my next priority was to salvage something out of the situation we were in, so that my wife and my kids were, my boys were grown up. They were looking after themselves. One wasn't even in the country, but I had to support my wife, Sue, and I. We were only 54, 53. We had, many years. We've already had 20 of those years. We had years of life left that we had to do something with. So sitting in jail was not going to help her or me in any way. So at that point, the most sensible decision was to move on.
It's so fascinating to me. I think it's such an interesting, firstly, I think your life story in general is super interesting. I think I saw you mentioned somewhere in your writing, an old, I think it was a Chinese proverb, like, hopefully you're lucky enough to live in interesting times. And I think that's such a
Absolutely.
cool way to think about it because of your life. But particularly that situation to me is so fascinating from a philosophical perspective, because it asks the question, and I'm asking this genuinely, openly, how do you make that determination, right? Some people would have made that determination much sooner to say, this isn't worth
yes.
it. You know, I'm just going to give up sooner. Some people may have said, I will never give up. I will die in a jail cell. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong. To me, it's just super interesting how we make that decision, because back to your original value of courage and that conviction in it, how do you determine where that line is to say, no, now this no longer makes sense versus it does? Because I think a lot of people conceptually would say, yeah, courage, belief in your convictions is good, but that subjectivity of where you draw the line and you say, well, that's too far, or that's not, I think is just super interesting.